So as I said, we are connected with the FT studio, and also with Simon Mundy, that I will welcome on stage now with me for our conversation. Hi, Simon. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, Virginia. How are you?
We are great. Thank you very much. And thanks for being part of the award day of the FTxSDG challenge. So I'm going to give a brief introduction for the people that don't know Simon, that I don't guess there are many. And then we're going to have a nice conversation around your passion for, of course, the fight to respond to climate change, as well as your different journeys, I think, that have been, represented in your book and in your career. So Simon was born in the UK and he has been reporting for the Financial Times since 2010 and was recently appointed a Moral Money editor. And you already know what Moral Money is our hub for really discovering not just ESG or SDG, but really what's the future of our planet and our world. So he's covering the push for a cleaner and more sustainable world economy for the award-winning Moral Money platform. He started his career in Johannesburg, where he joined the FT to cover Southern Africa. And then he has been reporting as a corporate reporter in London. Then he spent several years between Asia, Seoul, and Mumbai. He is the author of Race for Tomorrow, that I have here today, and that I've read right before this conversation. And I was amazed by the fact that Simon has been traveling for nearly 2 years, really through 6 continents all over the world, and try to tell stories of the diverse cast of characters locked in this historic struggle that is the one for climate change. So Simon, I would love to go to the first question that maybe, many people out there, especially, the young entrepreneurs and innovators would have for you. So why are you so passionate about this topic? How everything started? Tell us a bit more how you came up with the idea of the book, but above all, what has been really driving you to say, I want to push my career to really take a stand and talk about climate change?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, my background is as a foreign correspondent, not specializing always in climate change. It was in 2016, soon after I moved to India, and I went out to the countryside to see the impacts of drought in Western India, how that was affecting farmers. It's very, very serious, particularly in the state that I was in, Maharashtra. So I went out there, I had just arrived in India, I saw these extraordinary impacts, dams, reservoirs that were completely empty of water, dry and cracked ground. Farmers that I spoke to were telling me about the very, very severe impacts that they were suffering. And it just struck me, God, people talk about climate change as something that will be a problem in the future, that will be a problem for our grandchildren. But for these farmers that I was speaking to, it is a problem right now. And it was very clear looking at the meteorological charts. There is a very clear trend in the rain patterns as a result of climate change. So that woke me up to the scale of the problem. And I realized, of course, it's not only farmers in India, there are people all over the world who are being very seriously affected by the direct physical impacts of climate change. And the more I looked into this subject, the more I realized it's not even just that. It's not only people who are hit by the immediate physical impacts, but people in every walk of life, in every industry. This is reshaping the global economy. This is reshaping global business. And also in terms of the global balance of power between the US and China and Russia, this is reshaping all of that. And I just suddenly thought as a reporter, good God, this is by far the biggest story of the century. And this is something that I want to learn more about and focus on professionally. So that was how I had the idea for the book. So the idea for the book was to really take a reporter's approach to this. So I'm not coming at it as an activist. I'm not coming as a scientific expert. I'm a reporter. What I do is I get on the ground and I meet people and I hear their perspectives and try to make sense of it and share that with the reader. And to really do justice to the scale and drama of the story, I just realized I'd have to go on quite a long journey. So I set out, it ended up taking me through 26 countries over the course of 2 years. And I met all kinds of people, from Prince Abdulaziz, the energy minister of Saudi Arabia. I went down a cobalt mine, in an illegal hand-dug cobalt mine in the Congo, and spoke to the people who were working in there, winemakers in Chile, mammoth tusk hunters in Siberia. And all of these people they're leading very, very different lives, and they have very, very different backgrounds, but they are all in their way playing a part in the same story, which is the story of the 7 billion people on this planet waking up to the realization that we have been playing a very dangerous game with the climate. We're suffering the impacts, and we have to totally rethink the way the world works in response. And I hope that the resulting book is something which can just help people to get a handle on this story in perhaps a different way from previous books. I think a lot of people have had the sense of this as a subject that's very difficult to get started on. Where do you begin? It's so huge, it can seem very dry, it can seem very politicized and very abstract, but actually within that are the most extraordinary and compelling human stories. And I felt that if I could present those, the stories of the people that I met, their lives, the extraordinary places where they lived, then that could help people to start getting a grip on this story and some of the key issues that we are all going to have to grapple with in the years and decades to come.
Thank you very much, Simon. And, definitely, I think you have so many stories to tell and shares, and I guess so many experiences of entrepreneurs that you also have met throughout your journey. And, this FTX SDG challenge with Seedstars and FT has been all about empowering entrepreneurs and letting innovative younger thinkers have the opportunity to shine and use this as a platform, to express their ideas, their startup ideas, but also, a bit of their vision for the future. Let's imagine that, you are an entrepreneur right now, and you are active in an emerging market, and the people listening to you today and to us today are really trying to bring a change from an entrepreneurial angle. So what would you be focusing on? What are the kind of key actions that you would be thinking of? And maybe then we can revert them as suggestions for the entrepreneurs out there.
Yeah, so I think I should say, by the way, that I'm not sure any of the finalists need any advice from me. I mean, it's been inspiring to see some of the work that these companies are doing, and it's a really great set of companies doing really exciting things across the world and across many different sectors. So on the climate side in particular, I think it's been good to see there's quite a wide range of different companies there. So from companies looking at circular economy, recycling, to greater use of public transport and electrified transport and expanded solar power. So that's all really great to see. I think one of the things that I would hope to see lots and lots of companies attacking in the future is these areas where you have the intersection between climate and other issues. So this is something that Al Gore talks about a lot, and I think he's right on this, that you cannot see climate change in isolation from other challenges. Clearly, it's very closely interlinked with questions of poverty and human health. I think things that could be approached really well here is, if you look at energy access, this is a big problem that we have. There are many, many people in the world who don't have access to modern energy solutions. And the emphasis at the moment, this is something that I was told a lot in Saudi Arabia. Look, we need natural gas because, for one thing, we need to get cleaner cooking solutions to people in poor countries who are currently using firewood, which is very bad for indoor pollution. And at the moment, they do have a point. But what about in the future, if we were able to bring about more effective zero carbon cooking solutions for people in poor countries? Now, that's something that is not really there yet in terms of electric cooking stoves and, in terms of having them working with an unreliable electricity supply. That sort of thing, just thinking, how do we tackle carbon emissions while also tackling poverty and energy access? Another thing that struck me in particular when I've been in places like Nigeria. Nigeria is a huge country with a very unreliable electricity system that doesn't reach a lot of people in the country at all. Huge opportunity there for distributed solar. And speaking to people when I was on the ground in Nigeria, people are very disappointed with how quickly that's been rolled out. But what an opportunity there is to bring electricity through to many people in the world who are not currently connected to an electric grid and may not be for a long time. I think there's a huge opportunity there, distributed solar, for entrepreneurs in almost every country, but particularly in some of the poorer countries in the world. Another thing that I think is worth looking at is storage. As we move more towards renewable-based electricity solutions, we're going to need a huge increase in storage. You know, the sun only shines during the daytime. You ideally would want to have a way to store that power cheaply and efficiently 24 hours a day. So again, I think there's going to be all sorts of storage solutions needed. Something that struck me during my research is that storage is going to be absolutely key to how we tackle the climate crisis. So yeah, in these areas, you know, I could go on, of course, you know, transportation, there are so many opportunities. But I think, you know, something that struck me when I was in China, for example, meeting entrepreneurs out there, I met one entrepreneur called He Xiaopeng, who he started in the digital economy. He developed China's most popular mobile browser that was acquired by Alibaba. So he found himself as a top executive at Alibaba, you know, the big dog of the Chinese e-commerce industry. But he left and he's now running XPeng Motors, which is one of the big Chinese electric car startups. And he said to me, and other Chinese entrepreneurs in the space said the same thing, that, you know, this is where you want to be. This is where the highest growth is going to be. If you're an ambitious entrepreneur, and it's not just in China. I think increasingly people all over the world are realizing that.
Thank you very much. And if there is something very evident here, that is all the SDGs are really interconnected. It's not just about climate action, but as Simon, you were saying, and as we've been saying in all our panels, is all about the interconnectivity of all the different SDG, and tackling one doesn't mean that you are not tackling others. And also in Simon's, in your answers, Simon, I can feel there is a lot of practical vision and also actions, and it's pragmatism in what comes out. And I think it's I have a bit of a political question for you, because of course, you know, you took part to so many international events, COP26, as well as for your more money job, you interview and report on experts. So I would have a question that I think many of us do have in terms of is there really a connection between the high diplomacy, the great talks that we hear, and actually what you document and what you see on the ground? And if is it missing, what can we do? Maybe, you know, FT as a platform, as much as the entrepreneurs out there, to maybe make the connection a bit more clearer?
Yeah, so something that struck me a lot during my research was the incredible imbalance when it comes to rich countries and developing countries when it comes to climate change. Overwhelmingly, this is a crisis that has been driven by the rich countries. Certainly, if you look at it on a per person basis, yes, China is currently the biggest emitter, but historically, and especially on a per capita basis, the rich countries have an overwhelming share of the responsibility. And the impacts are disproportionately felt by poorer countries. In countries where people tend to be living in tropical areas of the world, which are more vulnerable to certain extreme weather events, as well as the fact that people in these countries are often more dependent on farming, so there's an extra vulnerability there. So that's an obvious injustice. You know, the rich countries have caused a problem which is disproportionately affecting less rich countries. And in an ideal world, we would see very significant support being given by those rich countries to the poorer countries. Now, as I'm sure everyone knows, there was a promise by the rich countries made more than a decade ago that by 2020, they would be delivering $100 billion a year in climate finance to poorer countries. Now, that number, if you look at the scale of the work that's needed, that number is way too low anyway. But even that number was missed by a long way. And at COP26, we didn't see much progress, in my opinion, towards the sort of much greater assistance that should be needed there, that is needed there and should be deployed. And in terms of the reasons for that, I do think that even in the internet age, there is still this sense of disconnection between people in rich countries and people in the poorer countries who are feeling the worst effects, and also the leaders in the rich countries. I think that's where there is a role for the media to try to explain these things better, as well as we possibly can, explain how urgent this is for many people in the world. I mean, there are stories in my book that were very tough to report in a way. I mean, just because the people that I encountered in certain places are really going through tough experiences. Northeastern Ethiopia, for example, the Afar herding people. I mean, they have an incredibly long-standing and rich culture. Now, they've never been sort of fabulously luxurious in their lifestyle, but they had a sustainable culture, which is now being devastated by the impacts of climate change. They're now dependent on government food handouts. They've been hit by drought. They've been hit by locust invasions, both of which are connected with climate change. And I do feel if there was just a greater understanding, a greater sense of contact with what they're going through on the part of people and especially government leaders in the rich countries, then we would see more movement, more significant movement, and a greater level of ambition at events like COP26. But I certainly don't think that it has to be that way. I would hope that at COP27 will be in Egypt. This will be an African COP. That's how it's being presented. And I think we will see that greater voice. So COP26 was not good enough. But the question for me is, how can we make sure that COP27 and COP28 and COP29 are better? And I think the key is to focus on that idea of a just response to the climate crisis.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I would have now a question that I know that is going to be very interesting for a lot of the tech entrepreneurs out there. Because in your book, but as well as in this challenge, we have been mentioning and saying how important technology can be to try to tackle the different SDG. In your book, you mentioned as well how technology startups are working on the climate crisis. Do you want to share some of the insights and examples that you discovered?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many. It's hard to know who to leave out because it's a big part of the book, as you say. One, for example, that I think has captured a lot of people's imagination is Climeworks and Carbfix, their partner. So I'm sure a lot of people in the audience will have heard something about them. Climeworks started out as these two young German engineers based in Switzerland, at ETH, the famous Swiss university in Zurich. And they decided we need to find a way to remove carbon dioxide from the air on an industrial scale. So they built these collectors, as they call them. And these are boxes 2 meters cubed, which have a fan at one end. It sucks carbon dioxide from the air. There's a sort of membrane in the middle that absorbs the CO2. And then when it's saturated, they close the box, it heats up, carbon dioxide is released. But then the question is, what do you do with all that carbon dioxide? You don't just want to put it back into the air. That's when they got in contact with another startup in Iceland called Carbfix. And Carbfix have this technology where you get CO2, you dissolve it in water, you pump it underground, and it turns into stone in the Icelandic bedrock, limestone. There's a chemical reaction. And they're doing it. So I visited the site where they're doing it. Their customers include Audi, Square, Microsoft, Bill Gates. So they're really getting moving with it. Now, their costs are still high, their scale is still small, and they would need to scale up a lot. So each of these boxes, which they're developing, these 2 meter square boxes, that can absorb or it can suck out of the atmosphere 50 tons a year of carbon dioxide. And global greenhouse gas emissions are 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. So you need 1 billion of these boxes to cancel that out. But when I put this to Christoph, one of the co-founders of Climeworks, he said, well, yes, that's true. But for one thing, I hope that those emissions will come down. And secondly, this is one of many solutions that we're going to have on the carbon dioxide removal front. But the other thing he said is, do you realize that human beings make almost 100 million passenger cars every year? So these boxes are actually easier to make than a car. So if we wanted to make 100 million of these per year, well, we could. Now, I'm not predicting that he is going to make 100 million of those a year, but the point is, it's interesting when you start to think of things on a different scale with a different level of ambition. I think, human beings put a man on the moon more than 50 years ago, and you look at the extraordinary advances that we've made, the extraordinary speed with which we developed COVID vaccines. We actually can achieve amazing things as human beings if we set our sights high. And what's exciting to me about many of the entrepreneurs I met, to mention a few others, I met a startup in Massachusetts that's developing what they want to be the world's first commercial fusion power engine. So that would be incredibly powerful, incredibly cheap, safe, carbon-free power to deliver electricity on a new scale. They're making progress. They've just raised $1.8 billion in funding a few weeks ago. There's another company called Aleph Farms, which is growing steaks in bioreactors, which sounds pretty freaky to some people, but then at the same time, it's got a much lower environmental impact than beef farming. It can address the world's growing demand for protein, help to bolster food security. Perhaps we need to get more comfortable with things like genetically engineered foods or cultured meat. But the point is that these companies that I met, the level of ambition that they had, some of the things they came out with, there was one company, Lanzatech, that said, we want to supply most of the world's liquid fuel, which is a crazy sounding statement. There's another company, Impossible Foods, their founder, Pat Brown, said, I want to destroy the entire US beef industry. That sounds crazy. But people coming out with these crazy sorts of targets, they might not be that crazy, actually. We are going through, when you think about it, we've been living in the fossil fuel age since the 1700s. And that age has been an absolutely unprecedented era of human history. We've achieved extraordinary economic growth, extraordinary advances in living standards, but we've realized that the fossil fuel age now has to end quickly. So this is an enormous moment in human history. We're talking about a total rethinking and transformation of the foundations of our economy. So in that context, when people are coming out with very, very ambitious sounding goals, maybe that's actually the appropriate level of ambition, given the scale of the disruption that we face and the challenges that we have to tackle.
And honestly, ambition and what you are being now describing is really what we've been breathing in our virtual rooms and the studios, thanks to the startuppers and individuals that took part to this challenge. So I think definitely it's the first source, let's say, of the ideation is really the push of people as well on the ground, because let's not forget that all the people that we have been involving in this challenge are from or are working in so-called emerging markets. So I think this is really impactful, and it's gonna be, we're gonna see some of the results, I guess, quite soon. Also thanks to the Seedstars incubator and accelerator push. You talked a lot about I think positive innovation and the positive side. I don't want to be, of course, setting the tone of our conversation, but maybe you want to share for the people that maybe are out there of a larger public that are not, so convinced maybe about some of the innovations that you talked about. Maybe can we walk through some of the most shocking climate change stories that you came across in the 2 years of traveling, because I think you've seen many, and maybe you want to share quite moments and the things that you have discovered and that you talked about in your book, but maybe to let us know a bit more about the insights and what you find out.
Yeah, for sure. So the focus of the book was on what are people doing in response to these things that are happening. It's not simply about you know, the terrible impacts, which are very real, but it's about people's responses and how people also are helping us to understand those. So that, you know, the scientists in the book, there's one story in the book which I try to highlight because I think it puts the focus on the importance of science and the extraordinary contributions that a single individual can make. So this is the story of a scientist called Conrad Stefan. So we met in Greenland. He was almost at the end of his career. This was going to be his penultimate visit to the Greenland ice sheet. He had spent 30 years studying the Greenland ice sheet. And during that period, he had done as much as any climate scientist in the world to help the wider public to understand how serious climate change is. So when he first got to Greenland, there was not really an understanding of how serious climate change is where the Greenland ice sheet is concerned. Scientists at that time thought that the ice sheets of the world in Greenland and Antarctica respond to climate change over the course of centuries or millennia. But every year he would go out for weeks or months at a time to the Greenland ice sheet. He had a camp out there, and he discovered that the Greenland ice sheet was melting and shrinking far more quickly than people had previously realized. And this is incredibly important information when you consider the extent to which so many people all over the world living in low-lying coastal regions or on islands are very vulnerable to the impact of climate change. So his work did a huge amount to sound the alarm. Now, he told me when we met that the ice sheet was becoming increasingly dangerous. There are these crevasses opening up in the ice. And a few days after we met, there was an accident where he fell into one of those crevasses, and his colleagues were not able to find him. And it was a very tragic incident, of course, and his death brought a huge wave of tributes from around the world. Now, I think he would not have wanted to be defined by the accident that took his life. Now, the accident that took his life was in itself further evidence of the extraordinary impacts of climate change. These crevasses, he told me, were opening as a result of the faster shrinking of the ice. But he would want to be remembered for his work, and his work is still with us. His amazing scientific research, the work of further generations of scientists that he trained who are now doing climate science in Greenland and all over the world. These scientists are bringing together the most extraordinarily useful and powerful information that we can use, we can deploy to protect ourselves and to make the appropriate levels of investment to respond to the crisis that these scientists are doing such amazing work to identify for us. Without them, we'd be in much bigger trouble. We wouldn't even know what's going on, but thanks to them, we do know. And I think what he would have wanted is for people not just to think what a sad thing it was, what happened to him, but to think, you know what, we should really pay attention to his work and to the work of the other scientists around the world, because that's what it's all based on. This is the reason why it's important for entrepreneurs to be developing these solutions and these businesses to tackle this issue, is because the science is there and it proves that we urgently need it. And I think the greater focus that we have on that, the the more that the governments will act, the more that there will be support and that sort of enabling environment for the sorts of change that we need through entrepreneurs and through others. So I hope that we're going to see more of that in the future.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thanks so much for sharing this. And I think you just touched upon the role, I believe, as well of education when it comes to the climate crisis. For a bit more like traditional curricula that we see out there in schools, maybe there is still not a focus on what we've been discussing and tackling in the past few days and what you just explained to us. What do you think it might be in the next few years, we hope, the role of education and maybe, like the education system as a whole when it comes to the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think it's hugely important, of course. One thing that I've been quite concerned to see over the past couple of years is this real increase, as far as I can see, in what they call eco-anxiety among children and young people. And I think it's very real and very serious. I mean, and it's rational, right? If you're currently 10 years old, you should live for perhaps another 90 years or more. You will live into the 22nd century. So then the question is, what kind of century is that going to be when a 10-year-old is 80 or 90 or 100? At the moment, it does look somewhat scary. And I think, therefore, we need to, in the educational system, not just teach about the bad things that are in store, but help young people to understand what can be done in response. And I think, it's interesting. Someone put it to me as the 3 C's, the ways in which you can respond. You can respond as a consumer. There's a lot of emphasis on that more widely, and we should think about what we can do as consumers. So this is things like what you eat, the clothes that you wear, how you travel, and so on. The second one is what you do in your career. So many of those taking part in this event are focusing on it that way. I'm in my own way doing that too. But I think the one that is open to everyone, certainly everyone who's living in a democracy, is what you can do as a citizen. And I think this is something that young people have actually been leading the way on this. So if you look at, of course, Greta Thunberg, Vanessa Nakate, there's this new generation of climate activists who, in many cases, before they even had the right to vote, they've been having a real impact on policy discussions. So I think the education system needs to encourage young people to inform themselves. It should help them to understand the issues, and it should encourage them to go further and do their own research. But also, I think it's healthy to encourage young people to feel that they do have a voice, even before they have a vote, that they can use in all sorts of ways. And I think education, of course, doesn't stop when you're 18 or when you leave university. I mean, I think all of us have a certain, I don't know if I would call it a duty or a responsibility, but I think many of us really want to get our heads around this subject, and that involves educating ourselves. And then if you're no longer in school, you have to actually take the initiative yourself. But there are many resources out there for people to help them to understand these issues. I mean, the FT in its way is one of those resources, and so it's not just a job for teachers, it's also a job for people in the media, because I personally think that the only way that we have real serious action on the climate crisis, it won't happen without serious action by governments, and governments will act only when they feel that they are supported in this by the majority of the population. And that means that those people in the general population need to be understanding the issues and thinking about what to do in response. So education will be fundamental to that.
Yeah, and thank you so much also for connecting it to the role of media. And I think it's also with just for the audience to know, like even getting access to some of the coverage that Simon and the Moral Money team is doing is through a trial, even free for access for a month. So it's just, I think also a big push from the Financial Times, also thanks to the new agenda and what we are standing for. Maybe some of you saw it, how we needed to reshape and redefine the capitalism, and really trying to push our values out there as well when it comes to the climate action. I think the FT is really taking a stand here. So I think it's really important to underline maybe the power of media when it comes to fight the climate crisis. Of course, at the beginning, you have been sharing already so many optimistic and hopeful stories, but maybe there is one element that you have seen as maybe a red thread within the different stories that you came across, that maybe is one thing you are most optimistic about when it comes to the coming years, and maybe that can make a real tangible difference in the climate crisis fight.
Yeah, well, I think something which was really exciting to see was just the range of innovation that was happening. The fact that people on every continent are taking this seriously, governments on every continent are taking it seriously. So I think that was the common thread. It was this sense that people are not just sitting around waiting to see what happens. I think if you actually look in detail at what's happening within big corporate sectors, so for example, even in Saudi Arabia, for example, the world's biggest oil exporter, they're thinking very hard about how to protect themselves against a declining role for oil in the global economy. Now, many people would say that would still criticize the way in which they participate in all this. But the fact is, I got a sense of nervousness there, actually, because there is a sense, even in Saudi Arabia, that, you know what, things are changing. I got that same sense in Australia, looking at the coal industry. In Chile, for example, winemakers are now investing with incredible with incredible urgency to shore up their own business. So I think just the sense that something has changed. On the business side, I would say 10 years ago, when I started my career, there was a sense that companies would talk about climate change, they would sort of pay lip service to it, but it was not core to how they did business. It was somewhere in the margins. It was sort of for show. Now, today, we still do have problems with greenwash, and we still have companies that are pretending to take climate change more seriously than they do. But every company now is actually losing sleep over climate change. They're actually really thinking about how to make sure that they have a serious strategy on this, because they're under pressure. They're under pressure from consumers, they're under pressure from investors, and increasingly they're going to come under pressure from rules and regulations in the economy. One exciting conversation that I had on that front was with Frans Timmermans, who I interviewed for the book. He's the vice president of the European Commission. He's responsible for leading the European Green Deal agenda. Now, this is not to endorse any particular person or platform, but again, it's that sense of ambition. I think he, more than most politicians, was saying, we want to be thinking about a total transformation and recalibration of the way in which the European economy works. And because the European Union is such a big market, by putting carbon-related tariffs on imports, the EU could help to drive transformation. So hearing that on the policy side, hearing similar levels of ambition from people on the enterprise side, from people in business and entrepreneurs, it's all exciting. But it's important to stress it's not yet enough. We are still on the wrong trajectory. We're still on track for well over 2 degrees of warming, and every 0.1 degree of warming is very, very serious indeed. So I think things have been somewhat improving in terms of the level of ambition, the level of resources that are being deployed, but we still have a long way to go. And I think what we've seen over the past few years, that's very much just the beginning of where we need to get to. But that's why it's exciting to see, you know, a new generation of entrepreneurs coming through with exciting plans to tackle this, because we need them. We're still off track, and it's only through people deploying really smart ideas and getting support for those ideas and trying to move them towards serious scale. That's how we're going to really tackle this crisis.
Thank you very much, Simon. And we are receiving a few questions from the audience for the next few minutes together, if you would like to answer to some. And Hala is asking you, is it challenging to educate the importance of climate change and generally climate change in underprivileged communities where they strive to make a basic living? Any thoughts on impactful intervention?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point. I think people in such communities, often they just have many more things to think about, many more problems on their plate relative to people in privileged lives in rich countries. There's also often, unfortunately, an educational divide. Often these are communities where the schools are not well resourced, so people have not benefited from such good levels of education. They might not have so much access to digital news and so on. So it is more challenging. I do think it's important. I mean, for one thing, if people are going to be badly affected by the impacts of climate change, it's important for them to understand that as well as possible, to have information on that. But yeah, I mean, I would say more broadly, it's important in general to think about ways of helping to raise educational standards in these places, and to provide relevant information on particular threats, and that's got to be in part a job for the government. But there should be roles there for NGOs and potentially private companies too. And it's important also when you think, you know, the point that I made about popular support for serious climate action, that doesn't just apply to rich countries. That applies, for example, in India also, where India at the moment is a relatively large contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. So support for bringing that down, that will need the support of the public. So education is very important in countries like that too.
A lot of the founders and the startuppers here are asking a bit of your insight in terms of funding in Africa. So maybe you can share some of your insights, if any, in terms of getting funding when it comes funding opportunities, particularly for African-based entrepreneurs when it comes to their startups in the climate change fight. Specifically, we have here even Ampol from Kenya that has been working on banana stems to make bags and sanitary towels and banana wine. Any insight on how to get the funding, because they are really trying that another entrepreneur approaching climate change from small scale farmers can help very quickly in terms of identifying solution and improve a livelihood. Do you have any insights maybe from a bit more of a businessy side for them?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's more and more international impact investing. There are more and more funds that are looking to deploy funds with a real impact on social business or business that will have a really serious social impact. There's also more broadly, there's a growing emphasis on blended finance, which is various schemes where multilateral development banks and similar institutions can invest in partnership with private institutions. Now that's going to be largely for larger infrastructure schemes. But I think in general, there is a rising tide of investment from investors in developed countries looking to deploy their funds to have a positive impact in developing countries. I think that is going to be a longer term trend. I think even though we don't have enough recognition of the need for greater involvement there. I think there are many people who do see that need. And then, of course, there are a growing number of homegrown investors who are really looking to address these challenges too. So I think certainly it's tough, and it's probably tougher if you're in Kenya than it is if you're in California, to find investors who could be suitable for you. But I think, as far as I can see, the situation is improving, and I hope it will continue to improve in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Simon. And we are have really looked for this conversation with you, just to really, go through your trips and your journey in, of course, that we can find also in your book. But as well, I think, thank you so much for your insights and for sharing your stories. Maybe if there is one piece of advice you would give to the audience right now that is taking part of this competition, and some of them won the competition, some others are going to find, other opportunities, to, of course, make their idea shine, what would it be, the one piece of advice you would give them now? And then we'll greet you.
I think my sense would be, I mentioned Christoph talking about 100 million collectors a year. I think don't be too constrained by the way things are, the way things have been done. We are entering an era of really huge global disruption and transformation. It's largely to do with the climate crisis, but I think more broadly, a lot of things about the global economy are being reconsidered. And I think there will be an exceptionally big opportunity here over the coming years for disruptive, ambitious startups to make an impact. So think big. I think in that context would be a thing worth keeping in mind, because I think there's going to be this is an extraordinary time to be an entrepreneur, and I think there's going to be a lot of huge opportunities in the years ahead.
Thank you very much, Simon, and really thank you as well for your work and the enthusiasm that you're pushing out there to all of your, from my perspective, your colleagues, but all the readers towards the topic. So I really appreciate your time today with us for the FTxSDG challenge. I can't wait to read your next reports and interviews on this topic. So thank you very much, Simon, for joining us.
Thanks very much, Virginia.